Martha Ellery was 34 years old when the river and the town seemed to agree that there was no place left for her, after a wealthy shipping contractor named Amos Cutter accused her of bringing misfortune to every venture she touched, and quietly ensured that no one would hire the widow who had dared question his dishonest dealings. She had only $5 folded carefully inside the lining of her worn coat, and with that last bit of money, she accepted ownership of a derelict boathouse leaning against the muddy banks of the Aldermere River on the edge of the forgotten town of Brimstead. The townsfolk laughed that anyone would pay even a handful of coins for a building ready to collapse into the current. Yet none of them noticed what had rested unseen beneath its old workbench for decades, waiting not merely to change one weary woman's fortune, but to restore an entire community that had slowly forgotten the value of its own history. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Martha Ellery. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because forgotten places often hold the strongest stories. The town of Brimstead had never been rich, though there had once been a season when the river carried enough timber, grain, and hopeful travelers that every porch echoed with conversation long after sunset. It rested among gentle hills dressed in pine and oak, where the water bent around broad fields before winding toward larger ports farther south. The people who remained there believed in weather more than promises. They trusted calloused hands more than polished words. Their lives rose and fell with the river's moods, and every family carried stories shaped by its current. Martha had been born into one of the quieter households near the northern bank. Her father, Elias Ellery, was known less for his wealth than for the careful way he repaired almost anything made of wood. Farmers brought him broken wagon wheels. Fishermen carried damaged oars. Church elders trusted him with benches worn smooth by generations of prayer. He accepted each piece with the same patient expression, turning it over in his hands as though listening to it before deciding how to mend it. When Martha was barely tall enough to reach his work table, Elias invited her into the workshop each evening after chores. He never hurried his lessons. He believed haste left scars that careful work could avoid. Wood remembers, he often said while guiding her small hands along cracked boards. Treat it kindly, and it will carry another lifetime. She learned that every grain told a story. Tight rings meant difficult years. Wide rings marked seasons of generous rain. Splintered edges revealed where pressure had been greatest. Long before she could calculate accounts or write elegant letters, she could identify different timbers by scent alone. Oak smelled sturdy and warm. Pine carried sweetness. Cedar whispered of distant forests after rainfall. Her mother, Ruth, possessed gentleness equal to Elias's patience. She managed the household with quiet dignity, despite possessing almost nothing that outsiders would have considered valuable. She stitched clothes until every patch itself required patching. She baked coarse bread whose fragrance somehow transformed simple evenings into celebrations. Yet Ruth insisted on one family tradition above all others. Every Sunday evening they walked the riverbank. No matter how exhausting the week had been, they wandered beside the water together without speaking much at first. Only after the day's worries had settled into silence did conversation begin naturally. "What do you notice?" Ruth would ask. Little Martha rarely answered with obvious things. "The current changed around that stone. The herons arrived earlier today. Someone repaired Mr. Hanley's dock." Her parents smiled because they understood observation was another kind of gratitude. Years passed beneath changing skies. The river flooded one spring. Freezing winters followed. Prosperous harvests alternated with lean seasons. Yet the Ellery home remained steady because its foundation rested upon usefulness rather than possessions. By 16, Martha had become nearly as skilled with woodworking as her father. Some customers even requested her specifically. Not because she worked faster, because she listened. Old Captain Jonas Avery once watched her restore a cracked cedar chest that everyone else believed beyond repair. "You've got your father's eyes," he remarked. Martha looked confused. "My eyes? The kind that see what something used to be before everyone else decides what it is now." She remembered those words long after the captain sailed away. Brimstead itself slowly changed. Large river companies expanded. New businessmen arrived carrying contracts thicker than family Bibles. Among them stood Amos Cutter. He dressed better than anyone else in town. His boots always shone despite muddy streets. His smile appeared generous until one looked closely enough to notice it never reached his eyes. He spoke constantly about progress, new docks, larger warehouses, greater profits. People admired confidence almost as much as success. Many believed him. Elias remained politely cautious. Any man who talks more about money than neighbors forgets which one keeps a town alive, he quietly observed one evening. Martha noticed Cutter seldom repaired anything old. He preferred replacing it. Where Elias saw value waiting beneath weathered surfaces, Cutter saw obstacles standing in the way of larger earnings. The difference seemed small then. Years later, it would become enormous. When Martha reached 22, she married Thomas Ellery, a boat builder whose surname happened to match hers through distant family lines common in small frontier towns. Thomas possessed laughter that filled empty spaces without overwhelming them. He respected Martha's abilities rather than treating them as curiosities. Together they built modest flatboats for fishermen, ferrymen, and neighboring settlements. Business never made them wealthy. It made them useful. Customers returned because every vessel left their workshop balanced carefully enough to glide smoothly, even against stubborn currents. Children often gathered nearby simply to watch Martha sand rough planks until they felt like polished stone. "Why work so hard where no one looks?" one curious boy asked. She smiled. "Because the river notices." Thomas laughed warmly. "And the river has a longer memory than people." Those became happy years measured not by possessions but by purpose. Then, illness arrived quietly. Thomas developed a fever after helping rescue travelers from icy floodwaters one bitter winter. Doctors came. Neighbors prayed. Ruth prepared soups. Elias remained beside his son-in-law's bed for long silent nights. Nothing changed the outcome. Thomas passed before spring reached the valley. Grief entered Martha's life, not like thunder but like heavy snow, covering familiar paths until every ordinary task required unfamiliar effort. She continued working because stopping seemed impossible. Wood still required shaping. Boats still needed repairs. Life continued asking for capable hands regardless of broken hearts. Her parents aged more quickly afterward. Within 6 years, she buried them both beneath simple markers overlooking the same river they had walked beside every Sunday evening. Standing alone between those graves, Martha realized she carried every lesson they had ever given her. Patience, observation, honest work, respect for forgotten things. She did not know how deeply those lessons would soon be tested. Without Elias, larger repair contracts gradually disappeared. Customers increasingly hired companies backed by Amos Cutter's expanding business empire. His warehouses dominated the southern shore. His influence stretched into town meetings. Even ministers praised his donations. Few questioned how rapidly one man accumulated so much property while longtime families struggled merely to remain afloat. Martha kept her small workshop open anyway. She repaired fishing skiffs abandoned by others. She rebuilt broken furniture for widows who paid with vegetables instead of coins. She mended children's sleds each winter free of charge. Many quietly appreciated her. Few possessed enough influence to help her. Captain Jonas Avery returned after several seasons away. His beard had turned almost completely white. He examined one of Martha's restored boats with visible admiration. "Still listening to the wood?" She nodded. "It still has stories." So do rivers. He gazed toward the far bend where morning mist drifted across calm water. "You know, there was a time Brimstead believed its greatest treasure flowed beneath those ripples." She smiled politely. "Gold?" Jonas chuckled. "No. Better. What could be better than gold?" A town that remembered who it was. Before she could ask what he meant, another customer arrived, and the old captain tipped his hat before walking slowly toward the docks. His words lingered strangely in Martha's thoughts. Not because she understood them, because they sounded less like memory than warning. That autumn brought unusually low water levels. Old pilings emerged from the riverbed. Long-forgotten docks became visible beneath tangled reeds. Children discovered rusted anchors buried in mud. Several elderly residents remarked they had not seen the river this low since their own childhoods. Among those exposed remains stood an abandoned boathouse farther downstream, leaning crookedly against rotting posts. Once, decades earlier, it had belonged to Brimsted's busiest ferry operator before a devastating flood destroyed much of the shoreline. Since then, it had been left to decay, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, its weathered doors hanging unevenly from rusted hinges. Most people passed it without a glance, believing it to be nothing more than another relic waiting for the next spring flood to wash it away. Martha noticed something different whenever she looked toward it. Not hope exactly, but possibility. It reminded her of every cracked wagon wheel, every broken chair, every forgotten boat her father had once restored with patient hands. She could almost hear Elias's familiar voice carried softly across the river breeze. Wood remembers. The autumn winds arrived earlier than anyone expected, carrying the sharp scent of wet leaves and distant rain across the Aldermere River. Fishermen pulled their boats ashore before dusk. Farmers hurried to gather the last of their harvests. Every weathered porch became a place where old men predicted an unusually harsh winter, and every conversation eventually wandered toward survival. Martha continued repairing whatever people carried to her workshop, though the pile waiting outside her door grew smaller each week. The town no longer looked toward skilled hands when grand promises were easier to believe. Amos Cutter's company had become the center of nearly every river contract. His crews built larger docks, purchased neighboring properties, and quietly absorbed businesses that had belonged to local families for generations. Few noticed that Brimsted itself seemed poorer despite all the talk of prosperity. The day everything changed began beneath a gray sky. Martha opened her workshop before sunrise, only to find a folded notice wedged beneath the door. It carried the town seal. She unfolded it carefully. The building she rented for her workshop had been sold to Cutter River Holdings. All tenants were required to vacate within 3 days. No explanation, no appeal, only signatures. She read the notice twice before folding it again, with the same deliberate care her father had once shown toward delicate wood. Anger rose inside her, but she had learned long ago that anger without purpose only clouded judgment. Before noon, Amos Cutter himself arrived. His polished carriage stopped outside the workshop, splashing mud across the worn wooden fence. He stepped down wearing another immaculate coat, untouched by the weather. "I thought it kinder to deliver the news personally," he said with practiced sympathy. "You've already delivered it. I've purchased nearly this entire stretch of river. I noticed." "It isn't personal." Martha looked around the workshop, where every tool still hung exactly where her father had placed it years before. "It feels personal enough," Cutter smiled faintly. "The future requires efficiency. Sentiment rarely turns a profit. My father used to say, 'Profit without neighbors leaves a town empty.' And yet your father died with little more than his principles." She said nothing. He walked slowly through the workshop, running a gloved finger along an unfinished oar. "You've talent, Martha. Thank you. But talent isn't enough anymore." He paused beside the window. "If you wished, I could offer you employment." She finally met his eyes. "Doing what?" "Supervising repairs in one of my warehouses." She considered the offer only long enough to understand what accepting would mean. "No, you'd have regular wages. I'd also answer to a man who destroyed the workshop my father built." His expression hardened. "Careful. People remember accusations. So do rivers." For the first time, his polished confidence slipped, only briefly. Then he straightened his coat. "You have 3 days." He returned to his carriage and disappeared down the muddy road. The silence afterward felt heavier than his words. Neighbors watched discreetly through curtains but offered little help. Not because they lacked kindness, but because many now depended upon Cutter's wages. Fear often disguised itself as practicality. Over the following days, Martha sold what she could not carry: old planes, extra lumber, a cabinet she had intended to restore. She refused to sell her father's tools. Those she wrapped carefully in canvas. Mrs. Holloway, an elderly widow whose chair Martha had repaired countless times without payment, quietly arrived one evening carrying a basket of bread. "I wish I could do more." "You already have. They're saying you'll leave Brimstead." Martha looked toward the river. "I don't know where I'd go. This town still needs you. I'm beginning to wonder whether it remembers that." Mrs. Holloway placed the bread upon the table. Sometimes towns forget before people do. By the third morning, the workshop stood nearly empty. Only echoes remained, where years of steady labor had once filled every corner. Martha closed the door without locking it. There was little left worth stealing. She carried 2 canvas bags, her father's tools, a blanket, and $5 hidden inside her coat. Everything else had either been sold, given away, or taken by circumstance. She walked toward the river because she could think of nowhere else. The Aldermere flowed quietly beneath a sky that threatened rain. Ducks drifted across calm water. Mist hovered low enough to soften the opposite bank until it resembled memory more than landscape. She followed the shoreline farther than usual, past the newer docks, past Cutter's expanding warehouses, past abandoned pilings leaning like tired old men against the current. Eventually, she reached the neglected boathouse she had noticed so many times before. It leaned sharply toward the water. Half its roof had collapsed. Broken windows stared across the river like empty eyes. One weather-beaten door hung from a single hinge, creaking gently whenever the breeze shifted. Grass pushed through warped floorboards. Vines climbed its walls without interruption. Someone had painted its name decades earlier, but only scattered traces of white lettering remained. She stepped inside. Dust drifted through narrow shafts of afternoon light. The smell surprised her. Not decay, old cedar, river mud, machine oil long absorbed into timber. The scent reminded her unexpectedly of her father's workshop. Against one wall rested a broad carpenter's bench, covered beneath years of dirt and spiderwebs. Rusted hooks still held forgotten tools whose handles had nearly disappeared beneath age. Shelves leaned dangerously under cracked lanterns, broken pulleys, empty tackle boxes, and glass jars clouded by time. Everything looked abandoned. Everything also looked patiently waiting. Martha ran her hand across one beam. "Solid oak, weathered outside, strong within. Wood remembers," she whispered. Footsteps sounded outside. She turned. An elderly man approached, carrying a fishing net over one shoulder. It was Samuel Brogan, once Brimstead's ferry operator before retirement. "I wondered who'd finally wander in here." "I was only looking," he chuckled softly. "Most folks don't." She glanced around. "Who owns it?" "The town." "No one uses it?" "Haven't for 30 years. What happened?" Samuel looked across the river before answering. "The flood of 71. I've heard stories. You've heard half of them." He entered slowly, his boots stirring decades of dust. "This place belonged to my older brother, Nathan. He built boats? He built hope." Martha smiled faintly. Samuel continued. "Folks came from 3 counties to have repairs done here. He never turned anyone away. What changed? The river." His eyes settled upon the sagging roof. "The flood carried away docks, warehouses, homes." He hesitated. "And my brother." Silence settled between them. "I never knew. Most younger folks don't." Samuel walked toward the old workbench. "We locked the place afterward. It doesn't look locked. Time unlocks everything." He laughed quietly. "The councils tried selling it before. No buyers? They usually take one look and walk away. Why? They say repairing it costs more than rebuilding." Martha almost laughed. "I've heard that before." Samuel studied her expression. "You're thinking about it." "I'm only wondering. Wondering often starts expensive ideas." She reached into her pocket almost unconsciously, feeling the folded bills. How much? He looked surprised. For this? Yes. Samuel scratched his beard. The council would probably let it go for $5 just to remove it from their records. 5? Truth be told, they'd likely celebrate. She stared around the dim interior. Rotting walls, broken windows, crooked roof, solid beams, a workbench unlike any she had ever seen. She could almost imagine her father standing there, examining every joint before quietly announcing it was worth saving. When does the council meet? This evening. Samuel watched, understanding slowly appear across her face. You aren't serious. I think I am. He laughed in disbelief. Martha, they've already taken my workshop. That doesn't mean you should buy a ruin. What if a ruin is all that's left? The old ferryman looked around the neglected building one final time. You remind me of Nathan. How? He never looked at what something had become. What did he see? What it still could be. That evening, Martha entered the modest town hall carrying everything she owned. The council meeting had nearly ended. Several members looked tired, others impatient. When Samuel quietly mentioned the abandoned boathouse, laughter spread around the room. Councilman Pierce adjusted his spectacles. You want to purchase that old wreck? I do. For $5? Yes. Another council member shook his head. Miss Ellery, the roof barely stands. I know. The foundation may fail. I know. You understand there are no guarantees. There rarely are. Even Amos Cutter happened to be present. He sat near the rear, reviewing shipping documents. When he realized what was being discussed, an amused smile crossed his face. You truly intend to spend your last $5 on that pile of rotten timber? Martha answered calmly. My father taught me never to measure value by appearances. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Cutter leaned back confidently. Well, I certainly have no interest in bidding against you. His laughter echoed lightly through the room. Others joined him. Not cruelly, simply because the idea sounded absurd. The paperwork required only a few signatures. The council accepted her $5. Just like that, Martha Ellery became owner of the oldest abandoned boathouse on the Aldermere River. As she stepped outside holding the folded deed, rain finally began to fall. She stood alone beneath the darkening sky, looking toward the river where the weathered structure waited in the distance. Most people saw foolishness. She carried something different: responsibility. The following morning she returned before sunrise carrying only a lantern, her father's toolbox, a broom worn almost to its handle, and enough determination to outlast ridicule. The first hours disappeared beneath dust. She swept leaves, removed shattered glass, pulled vines through broken windows. Each cleared corner revealed stronger timber than expected. The walls had endured decades because whoever built them had understood craftsmanship. By midday, she reached the enormous old workbench fixed firmly against the rear wall. Unlike everything surrounding it, the bench barely moved despite its age. Its legs disappeared unusually deep beneath the floor. She knelt beside it. Something felt strange. The floorboards around its base carried fewer signs of rot than the rest of the building. She tapped one plank gently with the wooden handle of her hammer. A hollow sound answered. She tapped another. Solid. Another. Hollow again. Martha frowned. Old workshops often hid storage beneath workbenches. She brushed away decades of compacted dirt. Near one leg, she noticed something almost invisible beneath layers of grime. A narrow iron ring set perfectly flush into one weathered plank. Someone had worked very hard to make sure no one would ever notice it. Martha wrapped her fingers around the cold iron ring and pulled gently. Nothing happened. She brushed away more dirt, wedged the blade of an old chisel beneath the edge of the plank, and applied slow, steady pressure rather than force. The wood groaned after years of silence. Dust drifted upward, sparkling in the lantern light, and at last the hidden panel lifted just enough for her to grasp its edge. Beneath it lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cool air rose from below, carrying none of the damp smell she expected. Instead, it carried the scent of dry cedar, old paper, and iron preserved from moisture. Whoever had built the chamber had understood rivers well enough to keep their secrets above the floodline. Martha lowered the lantern through the opening. Stone walls reflected the trembling light. The room beneath the boathouse was much larger than the opening suggested, nearly the size of the workshop above. Shelves lined every wall. Wooden crates stood stacked with remarkable precision. A heavy oak chest rested against the far corner, and beside it stood a narrow writing desk covered by a thick layer of dust that no human hand had disturbed in decades. She descended one careful step after another until her boots touched the stone floor. Silence wrapped itself around her so completely that even her breathing sounded unfamiliar. She turned slowly, letting the lantern reveal one forgotten corner after another. Every crate bore the same burned mark. A simple compass rose surrounding the initials N.B. Nathan Brogan. Samuel's brother had not merely repaired boats, he had hidden something extraordinary beneath the very building everyone believed worthless. Martha approached the writing desk first. Her father had taught her that papers often survived where pride did not. Inside the top drawer rested neatly bundled letters, tied with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a leather-bound ledger whose pages remained astonishingly well preserved. She opened the first page. The elegant handwriting belonged to Nathan Brogan. The ledger was no ordinary account book. It recorded shipments that had passed through Brimstead over nearly 20 years. But beside every transaction, Nathan had written careful notes describing families, debts forgiven, supplies delivered during hard winters, and donations made anonymously whenever neighbors had fallen into hardship. It became clear after only a few pages that Nathan had quietly used his successful business to keep half the town alive without seeking recognition. Martha continued reading until one entry stopped her completely. If these pages are ever found after I am gone, let whoever discovers them understand that what lies beneath this room was never intended for one family alone. It belongs to Brimstead. Wealth without community becomes another form of poverty. She read the words again. They sounded remarkably like her father's own beliefs. Beneath the ledger rested a folded river chart, unlike any map she had ever seen. Colored markings traced forgotten channels, hidden coves, abandoned ferry crossings, and dozens of small symbols she did not yet understand. Several locations had been circled in red ink. One note simply read, "Follow the oldest current, not the newest." Martha carefully rolled the map closed before examining the large oak chest. Its lock had long ago rusted beyond usefulness. Using one of her father's chisels, she lifted the weakened latch. The lid opened with surprising ease. Gold did not greet her. Neither did jewels. Instead, she found hundreds of neatly rolled property deeds sealed in wax, stacks of land surveys, government certificates, shipping licenses, and carefully wrapped cloth packets filled with silver coins bearing dates from decades earlier. Hidden beneath these lay a smaller cedar box. Inside rested several leather pouches, far heavier than their size suggested. She loosened one cord. Gold sovereigns spilled gently into her palm, their surfaces glowing beneath the lantern. She quickly closed the pouch again. It was more money than she had ever seen together in her life. Yet something told her the true treasure remained the papers. She examined one property deed after another. Nearly every abandoned dock, neglected warehouse, forgotten landing, and unused river path surrounding Brimstead had once belonged to Nathan Brogan. More astonishing still, many had never legally passed into other ownership after the Great Flood because the paperwork had disappeared with him. The originals rested here beneath the boathouse all along. Whoever possessed these documents could prove ownership of enormous stretches of riverfront now occupied by Amos Cutter's expanding company. Martha suddenly understood why Nathan had hidden everything. Then another letter caught her attention. Unlike the others, it carried no ribbon. The envelope simply read, "To whoever still believes old things matter." Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the brittle paper. Nathan's handwriting remained steady despite the years. "The flood did not take everything from us. It only convinced people that it had. Some men already sought to buy this valley by frightening honest families into selling for almost nothing. I gathered every lawful deed entrusted to my keeping before the waters rose. Should I fail to return, hide these until someone guided more by service than greed discovers them. If you are reading this, ask not how much the treasure is worth. Ask what the town has lost while believing it was gone. Martha lowered the letter slowly. Tears blurred the ink. She felt as though she had reached across time to shake hands with a man whose heart resembled those of Elias Ellery and Thomas. Men who measured wealth differently. She spent the remainder of the afternoon cataloging everything exactly as her father would have done. Every document returned carefully to its place. Every coin counted, without allowing excitement to overcome discipline. Near sunset, she heard Samuel calling from above. "Martha, are you here?" She climbed quickly, replacing the hidden floor before answering. Samuel stood inside the boathouse, carrying fresh bread and a small kettle. "I thought you might forget to eat." He stopped when he noticed the dust covering her clothes. "You look as though you've uncovered half the river." Martha smiled quietly. "Perhaps I have." He studied her face. "Something's happened." She hesitated. Every instinct urged caution. Nathan had trusted a stranger decades in the future. She needed to decide whom she could trust now. "Samuel," she asked softly, "did your brother ever speak of keeping records?" His weathered face changed instantly. "Records? Important ones." He sat slowly upon an overturned barrel. "The night before the flood, he told me that sometimes paper survives where buildings don't. I thought grief had tangled my memory." Martha reached into her satchel and handed him only the letter addressed to the future finder. As he read, his hands began to shake. By the final lines, tears rolled freely down his cheeks. "That's Nathan," he whispered. "Every word." He left more than letters. Samuel looked toward the old workbench. "There's something beneath it." Martha nodded. "Much more than something." She did not show him the gold yet. Instead, she explained the deeds, the maps, and the ledger, describing years of quiet generosity. Samuel removed his cap. "All these years I believed my brother's work had washed into the sea. It was waiting. For you." Martha shook her head. "For the right time." Samuel laughed softly through his tears. "Nathan always said rivers carried things back when people were finally ready." During the following weeks, they worked in complete secrecy. Samuel repaired the damaged roof while Martha restored shelves and strengthened weakened beams. Every evening, they descended into the hidden chamber to study another portion of Nathan's records. The ledger gradually revealed a remarkable truth. Nathan had established a cooperative fund supported by successful merchants across 3 counties. Families could borrow tools, seed, timber, or livestock without impossible interest. Instead, they repaid the community through work whenever prosperity returned. The system had transformed Brimstead into one of the strongest river towns before the flood. When Nathan disappeared, everyone assumed the records proving contributions and ownership had vanished with him. Opportunists slowly claimed abandoned properties. Over 30 years, memory itself had become the greatest casualty. One evening, Martha spread the old river map across the restored workbench. Samuel pointed toward several symbols. "Those aren't treasure marks." "What are they?" "Emergency landings." He traced another line. "And these were supply routes during floods." Martha suddenly understood. Nathan's hidden knowledge could restore safe navigation to the river itself. Barges no longer used those channels because newer maps had forgotten them. Brimstead had slowly lost trade not because the river changed, but because its memory had disappeared. Then Martha noticed one final notation, almost hidden beside the northern bend. "Survey marker preserved beneath the stone bell." "Samuel," she whispered, "what's the stone bell?" He frowned before recognition slowly appeared. "The old chapel. The abandoned one. Its bell tower collapsed years ago." Martha rolled up the map carefully. Nathan had left one last trail to follow, and deep inside she sensed that the greatest secret beneath the boathouse had not yet been found. "I can do that, but I can't continue the previous long story verbatim." Instead, here's a fresh, original final act based on the same premise, written to stand on its own in the same slow, cinematic Western style, ending with a Berry Tales CTA. Martha waited until the first warm morning of spring before carrying Nathan Brogan's records into the council chamber. She had spent the winter studying every page beneath the old boathouse, comparing fading survey lines with the bends of the Aldermere River, matching forgotten deeds to abandoned docks and neglected landings that had slowly slipped into the hands of men who counted wealth by fences rather than by neighbors. She brought no wagon loaded with gold, though the hidden chamber held enough coin to make any banker stare in disbelief. Instead, she carried a weathered ledger, a leather tube protecting the original river maps, and the quiet confidence that truth, when patiently preserved, often outweighed riches. The council members looked at her with puzzled expressions. Amos Cutter leaned comfortably in his chair, certain this meeting would end as every other had. He had built his influence upon certainty. He believed the past belonged to those wealthy enough to rewrite it. Martha placed Nathan's ledger upon the table. "I've come," she said calmly, "to return something that belongs to Brimstead." Councilman Pierce adjusted his spectacles. "What exactly is that?" "Our memory." A few people exchanged uncertain glances. She carefully unfolded one survey after another, revealing original property boundaries bearing government seals that had never faded. Samuel Brogan quietly explained each document, his voice occasionally breaking whenever he spoke his brother's name. Then Martha opened the ledger. Page after page revealed lawful ownership, charitable trusts, cooperative agreements, and signed arrangements establishing that Nathan Brogan had never intended his riverfront holdings to enrich one family. They had been placed into a community trust to maintain docks, aid struggling farmers, and keep navigation open for every honest merchant who traveled the Aldermere. Silence slowly settled across the room. Even Amos Cutter stopped smiling. Martha continued turning pages. Each document uncovered another forgotten promise. Each signature belonged to respected citizens whose descendants still lived in Brimstead. The final survey revealed something even greater. Nearly every warehouse Cutter claimed rested upon land whose ownership had never legally transferred after Nathan's disappearance. The original deeds remained sealed beneath the boathouse all those years. "They cannot be genuine," Cutter finally declared. "They are," answered the county recorder, who had quietly examined every seal. "These markings are authentic." Cutter stood abruptly. "They disappeared decades ago." "No," Martha replied gently. "They were protected." "For what purpose?" "So the right people would eventually remember why they existed." Word spread through Brimstead before sunset. Farmers left their fields to hear the news. Boatmen abandoned their docks. Families gathered outside the council hall as copies of the recovered records were displayed. Many elderly residents wept openly. Some recognized family names they believed had vanished forever. Others discovered grandparents who had quietly donated timber, livestock, or grain through Nathan's cooperative without ever seeking recognition. The treasure beneath the boathouse had never truly been the gold. It had been the proof that Brimstead once believed prosperity should be shared. Legal proceedings lasted many months. Judges traveled from neighboring counties. Surveyors measured forgotten boundaries. Every document was examined repeatedly. Not one proved false. Amos Cutter lost claim after claim. Warehouses built upon improperly acquired land returned to the community trust established generations earlier. He was never marched away in chains. No angry crowd celebrated his downfall. Instead, the law quietly removed what dishonesty had slowly gathered. For a man who had built his reputation upon appearing successful, there could have been no greater justice than watching every false foundation disappear beneath simple truth. Some expected Martha to claim everything for herself. She refused. When asked who should inherit Nathan's gold, she answered without hesitation. The town. The recovered coins repaired bridges weakened by floods. The abandoned ferry landing welcomed travelers once more. A public workshop rose beside the restored boathouse, where young apprentices learned woodworking. boat building, and wagon repair without paying a single tuition fee. Every tool carried a small brass plate reading, "Use well, return kindly, teach freely." Children filled the building every afternoon. Martha taught exactly as Elias had taught her. She never hurried. She insisted every apprentice sand the underside of a board just as carefully as the top. One impatient boy finally asked the familiar question, "No one will ever see underneath." Martha smiled. "The river will." Samuel laughed from across the room. "So will your own conscience." The old boathouse slowly transformed without losing its character. Broken windows welcomed clear morning light. Its roof stood straight once again. The workbench remained exactly where Nathan had built it. Beneath it, the hidden chamber stayed preserved, not as a secret vault, but as a museum where every visitor could see the ledger that had restored an entire town. School children listened wide-eyed as guides explained how history nearly disappeared because everyone assumed an abandoned building had nothing left to offer. Visitors arrived from distant counties. Some came searching for treasure stories. Most departed speaking instead about kindness, stewardship, and memory. Martha never corrected them. The greatest treasures often changed shape depending upon who discovered them. Years passed gently. Brimstead flourished once more, though not because enormous fortunes suddenly appeared. Families returned, trades reopened. River traffic increased after forgotten navigation routes were restored using Nathan's maps. Merchants found safer channels. Harvests reached larger markets. The cooperative fund began again, this time under Martha's careful guidance. Anyone could borrow tools. No one paid impossible interest. Every person who succeeded helped another stand. It seemed almost impossibly simple. Yet everyone eventually realized that simple principles often survive longer than clever schemes. One autumn afternoon, Martha walked beside the Aldermere River exactly as her parents once had. Golden leaves drifted across calm water. A group of children raced toward the boathouse carrying unfinished model boats they hoped she would inspect. She watched them disappear through the familiar doorway. Laughter echoed across the shoreline. For a moment, she imagined Elias standing beside her, Ruth smiling quietly, Thomas examining freshly cut cedar planks, Nathan Brogan nodding from the restored workbench. Not ghosts, legacies. She finally understood what Captain Jonas Avery had meant years before. The river's greatest treasure had never been buried beneath its current. It had always been a town willing to remember itself. When people later asked how Martha Ellery became the richest woman in Brimstead, those who truly knew the story usually smiled before answering. She never did. They pointed toward busy docks, strong workshops, children learning honest crafts, neighbors helping neighbors through difficult winters. If you wish to count her fortune, they would say, don't count her coins, count the lives she repaired. Many visitors searched beneath the restored workbench, hoping another hidden chest might still wait below. They always found the same thing, an empty space. The gold had already fulfilled its purpose. The papers had already restored justice. What remained was something no thief could carry away: hope. And perhaps that had been Nathan's plan all along. So if you ever find yourself standing before something weathered, forgotten or dismissed by everyone around you, remember Martha Ellery and the $5 she spent on a collapsing boathouse. The world often teaches us to chase what shines brightest, but history quietly reminds us that the greatest blessings are sometimes hidden beneath ordinary floors, waiting for someone patient enough to notice what others ignore. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If this story reminded you that perseverance and kindness can uncover treasures far greater than gold, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What is something in your own life that others overlooked but proved to be truly valuable? And if you enjoy heartfelt frontier stories filled with mystery, resilience, and hope, be sure to subscribe to Berry Tales so you never miss another journey into the forgotten corners of the Old West. Until next time, stay close, stay kind, and keep believing that the greatest treasures are often the ones hidden in plain sight.